They gave me 30 days to leave the house I built. My own children. That was my 80th birthday present. Not a watch, not a book, not even a poorly chosen sweater. They gave me an eviction notice wrapped in the cellophane of feigned concern. They sat across from me, their faces a carefully curated blend of sympathy and resolve, and told me my time was up. 30 days. The number echoed in the cavern of my chest, a death knell for a life I thought I knew. I looked at my son, Richard, the architect of this quiet coup, and I saw a stranger wearing his face. I looked at my daughter, Sarah, and my youngest, Michael, their eyes darting away, unable to meet my gaze. They were accomplices, dragged along by the sheer force of their older brother's ambition. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of 80 years, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn chill seeping through the window frames. It was the cold of absolute betrayal. And as they laid out their neat, tidy plan for the end of my life, a tiny, hard ember of defiance began to glow deep within me. They had given me 30 days. They had no idea what I could do with 30 seconds. But before the 30 seconds of truth, there were the 30 days of silence. The story really began on that Sunday, my 80th birthday. The house was quiet in the morning, the way it always was now that Eleanor was gone. I woke to the familiar scent of old wood, beeswax, and the faint, lingering perfume of my late wife's rose garden, a scent that clung to the curtains in the bedroom like a gentle memory. For 60 years, this house had been our sanctuary. I built it with my own 2 hands, a younger, stronger man with calluses like leather and a heart full of dreams. Every beam, every floorboard, every pane of glass was a testament to a promise I made to her on a rainy afternoon when we were barely 20 years old. "I'll build you a castle, Ellie," I had said, and she had laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It wasn't a castle, but it was ours. It was the place we had raised our children, celebrated triumphs, and weathered storms. It was where I held her hand for the last time, the house itself seeming to hold its breath with me. I made my way downstairs, my hand gliding over the smooth, worn oak of the banister. I had sanded that banister myself, finishing it until it felt like silk beneath the palm. The living room was filled with the soft morning light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny sprites. On the mantelpiece, photographs charted the course of our lives, our wedding day, me in my stiff suit, Eleanor radiant, the children as gap-toothed toddlers, family holidays at the lake. My gaze lingered on a picture of the 5 of us, taken about 15 years ago. Richard, already looking serious in a polo shirt, his arm around his wife, Chloe. Sarah, smiling her nervous, eager-to-please smile. Michael, the baby, still with a hint of boyish mischief in his eyes. And me and Eleanor, standing in the middle, the trunk of the family tree. We looked happy. We were happy. Or so I had believed. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, the time they had designated for the celebration. I opened the door to find them arranged on my porch, like a formal delegation. Richard stood at the front, a man who had inherited my height, but none of my patience. He was sharp suits and sharper smiles, a corporate predator who had long ago shed any resemblance to the boy who used to build forts in the living room. Beside him was Chloe, his wife, a woman who seemed to be perpetually appraising her surroundings for their monetary value. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, which were cold, calculating chips of blue. "Happy birthday, Dad," Richard said, his voice smooth and practiced. He handed me a gift bag that felt suspiciously light. Sarah and Michael shuffled behind them. Sarah hugged me, a quick, bird-like gesture. "Happy birthday, Papa," she whispered, her voice tight. Michael just nodded, a grim set to his jaw. He looked uncomfortable, out of place, a man forced to wear a suit that didn't fit. They filed into the living room, Chloe's heels clicking an irritating rhythm on the hardwood floors I had so lovingly laid. She ran a finger along a bookshelf, checking for dust. I saw the subtle curl of her lip. To her, this house wasn't a home, it was an asset. A shabby, outdated asset. "We brought a cake," Sarah announced, producing a pristine white box from a designer bakery. It looked sterile and perfect, nothing like the lopsided homemade cakes Eleanor used to bake, the ones that always tasted of love. We went through the motions. They sang a perfunctory, "Happy Birthday." I blew out the candles, 8 large ones, not 80 tiny ones, a concession to practicality that felt like another small erasure of a life lived. I cut the cake, the knife slicing through the expensive frosting with a clean, unsatisfying sound. The conversation was stilted, a collection of empty pleasantries about the weather, Richard's latest business deal, and the children's grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, whom I rarely saw. They spoke of their lives in a language I no longer understood, a dialect of stock options, resort vacations, and school districts. I was an island, and the tide of their modern lives was receding, leaving me stranded. I tried to bridge the gap. Michael, are you still enjoying the woodworking? I've got that old lathe in the workshop if you ever want to have a go. Michael looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Oh, yeah, Dad, Michael doesn't have time for hobbies, Dad, Richard cut in smoothly. He's managing a key portfolio now. We need him focused. The flicker in Michael's eyes died. He looked down at his plate. Richard's right. It's been busy. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The only sound was the clinking of forks on plates. I looked at the faces of my children, the people who were supposed to be my legacy, and I felt a profound and aching loneliness. This wasn't a celebration. It was an obligation, an item on a checklist. Finally, Richard placed his fork down with an air of finality. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, a gesture that signaled the true purpose of their visit was about to be revealed. Dad, he began, adopting the tone he probably used in boardrooms just before a hostile takeover. We need to talk about the future. I waited. I knew this tone. It never preceded good news. We've been worried about you, he continued, gesturing around the room. This house, it's a lot for one person. The upkeep, the stairs. You're 80 now. It's time to be practical. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We've found the most wonderful place for you, Arthur. It's called The Willows. It's more of a community, really. They have organized activities, gourmet meals, and on-site medical care. You won't have to worry about a thing. The gift bag. I glanced at it, sitting on the coffee table. It contained a glossy brochure. I was certain of it. My stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. I'm fine here, I said, my voice quiet but firm. This is my home. It was your home, Dad, Richard corrected me, the velvet glove finally coming off his iron fist. But things have changed. The property taxes are astronomical. The maintenance is a black hole for money. And frankly, it's not safe for you to be rattling around in this old place by yourself. I am not rattling around, I said, the words tasting like rust in my mouth. I am living, in the home your mother and I built. And that's a wonderful memory, Richard said, his patience wearing thin. But memories don't pay the bills. We've had an appraisal done. The value of this land, Dad, it's significant. Selling is the only logical move. It will secure your future and ours. There it was, the naked, unvarnished truth. It wasn't about my safety or my happiness. It was about the land. It was about the money. The house was just an obstacle. I was just an obstacle. We've already put a deposit down at the Willows, Chloe added, as if this were a triumphant final point. Your suite has a lovely view of the parking lot. I stared at them, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at Sarah, who was studying a crack in the ceiling, as if it were the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. I looked at Michael, who was chewing on his lower lip, his face pale. They were letting this happen. So you've decided, I said, my voice dangerously calm. You've all decided what is to be done with me. Richard sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. Dad, don't be dramatic. We're doing what's best for everyone. We've handled everything. All you have to do is pack. We'll give you 30 days to sort through your things. 30 days. The number hung in the air between us, a stark and brutal countdown. 30 days to dismantle a lifetime. 30 days to vacate my own heart. The cake on my plate suddenly seemed obscene, a mockery of celebration. The photographs on the mantel seemed to accuse me, their smiling faces asking how I had let it come to this. Something inside me, something old and resilient that I thought had died with Eleanor, shifted. It was not a snap. It was a slow, grinding turn, like a great stone being moved into place. I looked at Richard, at his expensive suit and his confident smirk, and I saw him not as my son, but as an adversary. He had made a critical miscalculation. He had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness. He had mistaken my love for this house as sentimental foolishness. He saw an old man, easily managed, easily discarded. He did not see the man who had built that house from the ground up, the man who had faced down bankers and bureaucrats, storms and sickness, all for the love of his family. That man was still here. He had just been sleeping. I stood up, my joints protesting, but my spine rigid. The sudden movement startled them. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Richard's face. "Thank you for the cake," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. "The visit is over. Please see yourselves out." For a moment, they were too stunned to move. Then Richard recovered, his face hardening. "Dad, we're not finished." "Oh, yes, we are," I said, turning my back on them and walking towards the kitchen. "You have given me 30 days. I suggest you make the most of them. Now, get out of my house." I didn't wait to hear their response. I walked into the kitchen and stood at the sink, gripping the cold porcelain until my knuckles were white. I heard their hushed, angry whispers, the scrape of chairs, and finally, the sound of the front door closing with a definitive click. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The party was over. The war had just begun. The first day of the 30 was the longest. I woke up feeling as if a heavy shroud had been laid over me in the night. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a prison on a countdown. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a second lost, a step closer to my exile. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own life, touching the furniture, the walls, the very air thick with memories that now felt threatened. This wasn't just wood and plaster. It was the repository of my entire adult life. I saw Eleanor everywhere, in the worn spot on the floral armchair where she used to sit and read, in the chipped teacup she had loved, which I still kept at the front of the cupboard, in the garden where her roses were preparing for their winter sleep. Losing her had been like losing the sun. Learning to live in this house without her had been the hardest thing I had ever done. But the house itself was a comfort, a tangible link to her. It was the last piece of her I had left. The thought of strangers tearing it down, or of Chloe walking through it with a developer, pointing out where a new, soulless McMansion could be built, was a physical pain. It felt like a second death for Eleanor. I opened the gift bag they had left. Inside, as I suspected, was the glossy brochure for The Willows. The cover showed a group of silver-haired seniors laughing, playing shuffleboard. They all had the same vacant, professionally happy smiles. The pages inside detailed a life of scheduled mediocrity. Bingo on Tuesdays, gentle yoga on Thursdays, movie night on Fridays. A life stripped of purpose and privacy, a waiting room for the end. They hadn't just handed me an eviction notice. They had handed me a script for my own erasure. I threw the brochure in the bin. For a week, I did nothing. I was paralyzed by a grief so profound, it felt like a physical weight. I ate little, slept less. I would sit in the dark, replaying that disastrous birthday party over and over in my mind. The casual cruelty of it. The way Richard had framed it as a kindness. The way Sarah and Michael had sat there, silent and complicit. My anger was a cold, dense star in my chest, but it was trapped beneath a thick layer of sorrow and disbelief. How had my children become these people? I thought back to their childhoods. Richard had always been ambitious, driven. Even as a boy, he organized the neighborhood kids into teams for games, always making sure he was the captain. I had been proud of his fire, his determination. I saw a future leader. I never imagined that leadership would curdle into tyranny, that his ambition would devour his compassion. I had paid for his expensive education, his MBA, believing I was investing in his future. I see now I was just funding the arsenal he would one day use against me. Sarah had always been the peacemaker, desperate to keep everyone happy. She would give up her own toys to stop an argument, her own desires subsumed by the need for harmony. That desperate need for peace had made her a coward. She would rather watch a terrible injustice happen than risk a confrontation. Her silence was not neutrality, it was surrender. And Michael, my youngest, He had been a gentle, artistic soul. He loved building things with me in the workshop, his small hands struggling to hold the tools. He had a good heart, but he had lived his entire life in Richard's formidable shadow, always seeking his older brother's approval, never quite believing in his own worth. Richard had molded him, shaped him into a subordinate, and Michael had let him, too afraid to forge his own path. The poison had been seeping into the family for years, but I had been too blind, or perhaps too unwilling, to see it. Chloe's arrival had been an accelerant. She saw our family not as a unit of love and support, but as a corporate structure with assets to be managed. She whispered in Richard's ear, fueling his greed, validating his ruthlessness. She taught him that sentiment was a liability, and I, wrapped up in my life with Eleanor, and then my grief after she was gone, had let it all happen. I had become a passive figure in my own family, a relic to be managed. This was as much my failure as it was their crime. That realization, on the 8th day, was the turning point. The sorrow began to recede, and the cold, dense star of my anger began to burn hot. The paralysis broke. I was not just a grieving widower. I was a builder. I was a fighter. I had built this house, this life, and I would not let it be dismantled by the careless, grasping hands of my own son. My first move was to find a new apartment. Not because I intended to move, but because I needed them to believe I was complying. I found a small, soulless one-bedroom in a concrete high-rise across town. The rent was extortionate, and the view was of a brick wall, but it was perfect for my purposes. I signed a 6-month lease, paid the deposit, and began to move a few things. Not the important things. I packed boxes of old clothes, kitchenware I never used, books I had already read. I made a show of it. I made sure to be seen by the neighbors, loading my car with boxes, a stooped, defeated old man. I knew word would get back to Richard. He would have his spies, neighbors he paid in polite conversation and feigned interest, who would report on my compliance. Let him think he had won. Let his arrogance be his blindfold. While I was packing the decoy boxes, I started on my real work. The house was not just a home, it was an archive. 60 years of receipts, documents, and records were stored in the attic and the office. I began to sift through them, my mission initially unclear. I was just looking for something, a tool, a weapon, a crack in the foundation of Richard's plan. I spent my nights under the glow of a single desk lamp, the house silent around me. I pulled out the original deed to the house, my name and Eleanor's, side by side, Eleanor Roosevelt Wilson. I traced her name with my finger. Upon her death, her share had passed to me, as we had arranged. The house was mine, free and clear. I had burned the mortgage papers in a celebratory bonfire in the backyard 20 years ago, so how could they force me to sell? The answer, I suspected, lay in a sheaf of papers Richard had asked me to sign about 3 years ago. I had been deep in the fog of grief after Eleanor's passing. Richard had come to me, his face a mask of filial concern. "Dad, we need to get your estate in order," he had said. "It's just some standard paperwork, power of attorney, setting up a trust. It will make things simpler down the line. It's what Mom would have wanted." I had trusted him. I was his father. He was my son. I had signed where he told me to sign, my eyes barely scanning the dense legal jargon. It was a mistake, a colossal, devastating mistake. I had handed him the keys to my kingdom, and he was now using them to lock me out. I couldn't find my copies of those papers. I searched my office, the filing cabinets, every drawer. They were gone. Of course they were. Richard was nothing if not thorough. That's when I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who understood the darker currents of family dynamics. Someone who could see this not just as a property dispute, but as a betrayal of the highest order. My mind went back decades to a young, hungry lawyer who had helped me with the zoning permits for the house. His name was David Davies. He had been sharp as a tack, a scrapper who relished a fight with the local bureaucracy. He was my age now, if he was even still practicing. I found his name in my old leather-bound address book. The ink was faded, but the firm was still there. Davies, and Son. The next morning, I put on my best suit, the one I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. It felt strange to wear it for a battle. I looked at myself in the mirror. The face looking back was old, lined with grief and worry. But my eyes were clear. The fog had lifted. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was a man with a purpose. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. A crisp, professional voice answered. Davies and Son, how may I direct your call? I'd like to speak to Mr. David Davies, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My name is Arthur Wilson. I'm an old client. There was a pause. One moment, please. I waited, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. This was it. This was the first real step. The quiet decision had been made in the lonely darkness of my home. Now, the action began in the bright light of day. David Davies speaking. The voice was older, gravelly, but it still held the same sharp edge of intelligence I remembered. David, I said, it's Arthur Wilson. I built a house out on Miller's Ridge 60 years ago. You helped me fight the council. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line and then a low chuckle. Arthur Wilson, my God. I remember that fight. You were a stubborn old goat even then. I imagine you haven't changed a bit. What can I do for you, Arthur? I trust you're not trying to build another extension without a permit. No, David, I said, a grim smile touching my lips. I'm trying to keep from being thrown out of the one I've got, by my own children. The humor vanished from his voice. I see. When can you come in? I'm on my way now, I said. The offices of Davies and Son were in an old, respectable brick building downtown. They smelled of old paper, leather, and strong coffee. David Davies had aged just as I had. His hair was a shock of white, his face a roadmap of a life spent in litigation, but his eyes were as bright and piercing as I remembered. He greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a comfortable, wood-paneled office. Arthur, it's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances, he said, gesturing for me to sit. Tell me everything, and don't leave out a single detail. For the next hour, I laid it all out. The birthday party, the 30-day ultimatum, the glossy brochure for the Willows, my suspicions about the power of attorney I had so foolishly signed, the missing papers. I spoke calmly, methodically, laying the facts out like bricks in a wall. David listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the bustling street below. Finally, he turned back to me, his eyes narrowed in concentration. A durable power of attorney, he said, more to himself than to me. It gives your son, Richard, broad powers. He can act as you, buy, sell, manage your finances. But it does not give him the right to act against your interests. It's a fiduciary duty, the highest duty under the law, forcing you from your home to liquidate the asset for his own gain. That's not just a breach of that duty. That's elder financial abuse. It's malicious. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. I wasn't just being sentimental. I wasn't crazy. I had been wronged, not just emotionally, but legally. But I signed it, David, I said. I willingly signed it. Under duress of grief and based on fraudulent misrepresentation of his intent, David countered, his voice sharp. He told you it was to make things simpler. He didn't tell you he was planning to sell your house out from under you and put you in a home. Did he? No, he did not. Good, David said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. That's our starting point. First, we need to get a copy of that power of attorney. He would have had to file it with the county to have it recognized for any property transaction. We also need to see exactly what he's been doing with it. We'll subpoena his records, your bank records, everything. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Arthur, this is going to be a fight. It will be ugly. Family disputes are the ugliest of all. He will say you're senile, confused, that you're a danger to yourself. He will try to paint you as an incompetent old man and himself as the dutiful son trying to do what's best. Are you prepared for that? I thought of Chloe's smug smile. I thought of Richard's cold, dismissive eyes. I thought of the brochure for the Willows. David, I said, my voice as hard as steel. I spent 2 years in the mud and blood of Korea. I came home, and built a life from nothing. I buried my wife. I am prepared for anything." A slow smile spread across David's face. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that. Let's get to work." The next 2 weeks were a blur of methodical activity. David's team moved with quiet, lethal efficiency. They filed the paperwork to get a copy of the power of attorney. As we suspected, it was a sweeping document, giving Richard near total control over my affairs. Seeing it in black and white, my own signature at the bottom, sent a fresh wave of sickness through me. How could I have been so blind? But David was unperturbed. "This is the weapon he thinks he has," he said, tapping the document. "We're going to turn it into a cage." While his team worked on the legal front, I had my own investigation to conduct. At David's suggestion, I started going through my financial records, cross-referencing my own bank statements with the official ones he had subpoenaed. For the first few years after I signed the document, everything seemed normal. My pension was deposited, the property taxes were paid, utilities were handled. It all looked like Richard was simply managing my affairs as promised. But then, about 18 months ago, I noticed something odd. A new account had been opened in my name, a home equity line of credit. I had no memory of opening such an account. I never would have. I hated debt. Eleanor and I had worked our entire lives to be free of it. I stared at the statement. The line of credit had been opened with a balance of 0. Then, a year ago, a single, massive withdrawal had been made. $400,000. $400,000. The number seemed to leap off the page. I felt the blood drain from my face. Where had that money gone? It hadn't been deposited into any of my other accounts. It had just vanished. I called David immediately, my hand trembling as I held the phone. "David, I found something." I explained the line of credit, the massive withdrawal. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head over the phone. "Arthur," he said, his voice tight with a controlled urgency. "This is it. This is the linchpin. He didn't just use the power of attorney to manage your affairs. He used it to secure a loan against your house. He leveraged your primary asset. But for what?" The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of breathtaking deceit. Richard's business. He had always been secretive about it, speaking in vague terms of investments and acquisitions. In recent years, whenever I asked how things were going, he would give a tight, forced smile and say, "Never better, Dad. Expanding." What if that was a lie? What if the business was failing? "His company," I said to David. "It has to be for his company. He needed capital." "And he used your house as his personal piggy bank," David finished, his voice grim. "But if the business is failing, that $400,000 is gone, and the bank still wants its money. The only way to pay them back is to sell the collateral, your house." It all made a horrible, perfect sense. The sudden urgency to sell, the story about my health and safety. It was all a lie, a smokescreen to cover his own desperation. He hadn't been planning for my future. He had been trying to save his own. He had gambled my home, my security, the very symbol of my life with Eleanor, on his failing business. And he had lost. The rage that exploded inside me was pure and white-hot. It burned away the last vestiges of my grief and sadness, leaving behind only a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about saving my home. This was about justice. This was about holding my son accountable for a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. "He thinks he has until the end of the month," I told David, my voice low and dangerous. "He thinks I'm packing boxes, a defeated old man shuffling off to a nursing home." "Let him keep thinking it," David said. "His arrogance is our greatest ally. We have him, Arthur. We have him dead to rights. Bank fraud, on top of the elder abuse. He used the power of attorney to secure a loan for his own benefit without your knowledge, and defaulted. He's looking at criminal charges." We had the evidence. We had the truth. Now, we just needed to set the stage for the final act. "I don't want to destroy him, David," I said, the words surprising even myself. "He is still my son, but he needs to learn that actions have consequences. I want him to understand what he has done." David was quiet for a moment. "There's a way to do this," he said slowly. "We don't file a lawsuit. Not yet. We arrange a meeting, a final settlement meeting, to sign the papers for the sale of the house. We get him in a room, on our turf, confident that he has won. And then we show him our hand. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was perfect. It was a trap built from his own hubris. "Set it up, David," I said. "Tell him I've agreed to his terms. Tell him I'm ready to sign." The final week of the 30 days was the strangest of all. I continued my charade, moving the last of the decoy boxes into my sterile apartment. I even spent a few nights there, sleeping on a cheap mattress on the floor, just in case Richard decided to drive by and check. The apartment felt like a tomb, cold and impersonal. But I wasn't a resident. I was a soldier in a forward operating base, preparing for the final assault. David's office called Richard to schedule the meeting. As predicted, Richard was smug and eager. He agreed to a meeting on the 29th day, the day before my deadline was up. He wanted to bring Chloe. "She's been so helpful through this whole process," he had told David's secretary. David had smiled when he told me. "Excellent. The more the merrier." On the morning of the 29th day, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house. The sun was streaming through the window, the same way it had for 60 years. I made myself breakfast, drank my coffee from Eleanor's chipped cup, and looked out at her rose garden. A profound sense of calm had settled over me. I was not afraid. I was not angry anymore. I was simply ready. I dressed in the same suit I had worn to David's office, but today it felt different. It was no longer a suit of mourning. It was my armor. I arrived at David's office an hour early. We sat in his conference room, a long, polished mahogany table between us. The documents were laid out in neat piles: the original deed to my house, the fraudulent power of attorney, the bank statements showing the $400,000 loan, and a letter from the bank indicating the loan was in default. It was a paper trail leading directly to Richard's ruin. "Are you ready for this, Arthur?" David asked, his voice gentle. I looked at the photograph of Eleanor I had brought with me from my desk at home. I placed it on the table, facing me. "I am," I said. At precisely 10 o'clock, Richard and Chloe arrived. They swept into the conference room, radiating an aura of victory. Richard was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, a confident smile plastered on his face. Chloe was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored dress, a large, expensive handbag clutched in her hand. She looked around the room with a proprietary air, as if she were already measuring it for new curtains. "Dad," Richard said, his tone magnanimous, "I'm glad to see you've come to your senses. This is for the best, you'll see." Chloe smiled at me, a flash of predatory teeth. "Arthur, I'm so pleased we can finally put this all behind us. We have the papers for the Willows right here. You just need to sign them after we've concluded things with the house." I said nothing. I just sat there, my hands folded on the table, and watched them. My silence seemed to unnerve them slightly. "Well," Richard said, clearing his throat and turning to David. "Mr. Davies, my father has agreed to the sale of the property at 24 Miller's Ridge. We're here to sign the final transfer documents so we can proceed with the listing." David leaned back in his chair, a placid look on his face. "Is that so? Arthur, is that what you've agreed to?" All eyes turned to me. I met my son's gaze directly. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. "That is not what I have agreed to." The change in the room was instantaneous. The air crackled with sudden tension. Richard's smile faltered. Chloe's face tightened. "Dad, what is this?" Richard demanded, his voice losing its smooth edge. "We had an agreement. You had 30 days. The 30 days are up." "You gave me 30 days to leave my home," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the entire room. "I am not leaving. This meeting is not about me signing away my house. It's about you answering for what you have done." Confusion warred with anger on Richard's face. "What I've done? I've been taking care of you. I've been managing your affairs, paying your bills, securing your future." "Is that what you call it?" David interjected, his voice like a whip crack. He slid a document across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Richard. "Mr. Wilson, perhaps you can explain this. It's a home equity line of credit, taken out against your father's property, a property he owns free and clear." Richard stared at the paper, as if it were a snake. He paled. That's just a financial instrument, for liquidity, a precaution." David slid another document across the table. And this? A withdrawal of $400,000 made a year ago. Where did that money go, Mr. Wilson? It certainly didn't go into your father's accounts. Chloe looked from the paper to her husband, a dawning horror in her eyes. Richard, what is he talking about? Richard's composure began to crack. This is a private family matter. My father is confused. He's old. He doesn't understand these things. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, speaking for the first time since my initial denial. I understand that you used the power of attorney, which I gave you in trust, to steal from me. You gambled my home on your failing business, didn't you, Richard? The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked trapped, a cornered animal. David pressed his advantage, his voice cold and precise. We have records showing the $400,000 was transferred directly to an account for your company, Wilson Holdings LLC. A company which, according to our research, is on the verge of insolvency. You didn't just breach your fiduciary duty, Mr. Wilson. You committed bank fraud by misrepresenting the purpose of the loan, and you committed felony elder financial abuse. These are not just civil matters. These are criminal offenses. You could go to prison for a very long time. The word prison landed like a physical blow. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp. She looked at her husband with utter contempt. You told me the business was fine. You told me we were expanding. You used his house. You lied to me. Richard's face, which had been pale, now flushed a deep, mottled red. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he was consumed by a tidal wave of impotent rage. He slammed his fist on the table, his eyes wild. He made me do it, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. All my life, living in the shadow of this house, the shadow of his perfect life with her. Nothing I ever did was good enough. The business. It was my chance to be bigger than him, bigger than this dusty old relic of a house. You owe me this. His voice cracked, the rage dissolving into a pathetic, childish whine. The powerful CEO was gone, replaced by a spoiled boy having a tantrum. It was a pathetic, ugly sight. I looked at him, at the ruin he had made of himself, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. I owed you my love, Richard, I said, my voice filled with a sorrow that was bottomless. And I gave it, freely. You are the one who placed a monetary value on it. This was never about the money. It was about respect. It was about family. It was about her. I tapped the photograph of Eleanor. And you desecrated all of it. David cleared his throat, bringing the proceedings back to a legal reality. My client is a merciful man, Richard. Far more merciful than you deserve. He is willing to forego involving the authorities on one condition. Richard looked up, a desperate, hunted look in his eyes. David slid a final document across the table. This is a revocation of the power of attorney and a full confession of your actions, indemnifying your father from the debt you incurred. You will sign it. You will turn over control of any and all of your father's assets. You will walk out of this office, out of his house, and out of his life. You will have no further claim on him or his estate, ever. If you refuse, I will personally walk these documents over to the district attorney's office this afternoon. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was Richard's ragged breathing. He stared at the paper, the instrument of his complete and utter defeat. His shoulders slumped. The fight was gone, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. Chloe stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. She picked up her expensive handbag. You are a fool, Richard, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You have ruined us. She turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, her heels clicking a final furious rhythm on the floor. Richard sat there for a long moment, utterly broken. Then, with a trembling hand, he picked up the pen. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He signed the document, his signature a frantic, illegible scrawl. He pushed the paper back across the table and stood up, his movements stiff and robotic. He walked to the door, a man suddenly aged by 20 years. He paused, with his hand on the doorknob, his back to me. Dad, he began, his voice a choked whisper. Goodbye, Richard, I said, my voice gentle but final. He flinched, as if I had struck him. Then he opened the door and was gone. The moment the door closed, a shudder went through my body. The tension of the last month, of the last hour, released itself in a single, deep, ragged breath. I leaned forward, resting my forehead in my hands. I didn't weep. I just breathed. David came and placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Arthur. You did it." I looked up at him, my eyes finding the photograph of Eleanor on the table. Her smile seemed to reach out to me, a silent affirmation. "We did it, Ellie," I whispered. "We saved our home." The aftermath was quiet. David handled the bank. With Richard's confession, the fraudulent loan was his sole responsibility. The lien on my house was removed. How Richard would deal with a $400,000 debt and a collapsed business was no longer my concern. He had made his choices. A week later, Sarah and Michael appeared on my doorstep. They looked ashamed, their faces etched with guilt. They stood on the porch, unable to meet my eyes, just as they had been at the birthday party. But this time, the reason was different. "Papa," Sarah began, her voice trembling, We are so sorry. We knew it was wrong. We were weak. We let Richard steamroll us. There's no excuse." Michael nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "He told us you were failing, Dad, that you were a danger to yourself. We wanted to believe him because it was easier than fighting him. I'll never forgive myself for that." I looked at them, my other two children. They were not malicious, like Richard. They were flawed, weak, and easily led. But they were not beyond redemption. "Come inside," I said, opening the door wider. We sat in the living room, in the same spots they had occupied on my birthday. But the atmosphere was entirely different. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. "I was disappointed in you both," I said, my voice even. "More than you know. Your mother and I, we tried to raise you to have a backbone, to stand up for what is right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You failed that test." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Michael looked down at his hands. "But," I continued, "family is not something you can just throw away. Not real family. If you are truly sorry, and if you are willing to rebuild the trust that has been broken, then we can start again. Slowly, honestly, with no more secrets." Sarah let out a sob of pure relief. Michael looked up at me, his eyes full of a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. "Thank you." It would be a long road. Trust, once shattered, is not easily mended. But for the first time in years, it felt like we were a family again, however broken. 2 days after that, I received one last call. It was from a restricted number. I answered, and a voice I barely recognized spoke my name. It was Richard. He sounded like a ghost. "Dad, Chloe left me. The business is gone. The bank. They're taking everything. I'm staying on a friend's couch. I have nothing." He was crying, a raw, desperate, ugly sound. "I'm sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Please, can I come home?" I listened to his pathetic pleas, the desperate begging of a man who had lost everything because he had tried to take everything. The old me, the man from a month ago, might have felt a pang of pity, a flicker of paternal duty. But that man was gone. I had been forged into something harder, something clearer, in the fire of his betrayal. I did not hate him. I did not wish him ill, but I could not let him back into my life. The poison had been excised. I would not invite it back in. "No, Richard," I said, my voice calm and resolute. "You don't have a home here anymore. You have to build your own. Goodbye." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I disconnected the landline from the wall and sat in the quiet of my living room. It was truly over. A 60-year chapter of my life had closed, and a new one was beginning. Months passed. The autumn chill gave way to the deep cold of winter, and then, slowly, miraculously, to the tender warmth of spring. I worked in the garden, preparing the soil for Eleanor's roses. The scent of the damp earth was rich with the promise of new life. Sarah and Michael visited every Sunday. not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There was no need. The lesson had been learned. Instead, we talked about their children, about Michael's renewed interest in woodworking, about the books I was reading. Michael brought over a small, beautifully carved birdhouse he had made. I hung it in the old oak tree in the backyard. We were healing. One bright April afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the birds flit in and out of the new birdhouse. The sun was warm on my face. The house stood behind me, solid and secure. It was more than just a house now. It was a symbol of my resilience, a testament to the fact that it is never too late to fight for yourself. I thought about my journey, from the shock and grief of that birthday, to the cold anger, to the quiet determination of my fight. I had been pushed to the very edge of my life, to a place where I was meant to become invisible, a footnote in my own story. And I had refused. I had refused to be erased. My children had thought they were dealing with a frail old man. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten the strength it took to build a life, to sustain a 60-year marriage, to raise a family, to endure loss. That strength doesn't just vanish with age. It concentrates. It settles deep in the bones, waiting for the moment it is needed. My battle with Richard was not about a house. It was about dignity. It was a fight for the right to exist on my own terms, to not be defined or discarded by others, even those I loved. It was a fight for my own soul. I had won. But the victory was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet. It was the peace I felt sitting on my porch. It was the genuine smile on Sarah's face. It was the pride in Michael's eyes as he showed me something he had built with his own hands. It was the enduring presence of Eleanor in every corner of this place, her memory now safe and honored. They gave me 30 days to leave. In the end, it was they who had to leave. They left behind their illusions, their greed, and their false sense of entitlement. I gave them 30 seconds of truth in that conference room, a truth so stark and bright it burned their world to the ground. And in the ashes, I found my peace. Life is not about what you accumulate. It's not about the size of your house or the balance in your bank account. It's about the foundations you lay, foundations of love, of respect, of integrity. If those are strong, you can withstand any storm, even the storms that come from within your own family. I am Arthur Wilson. I am 80 years old, and this is my home. I am not leaving.